Hello, this is the RPG Pundit, the final boss in Internet Shitlords. And as you can see, we've got Meatball here, currently facing away from camera. Okay. Before I start, I don't have it here yet, but I can mention that the Wilderlands sourcebook for Sword and Caravan has now come out. And it's available in drive-through and on Amazon. I think in a couple of other places like Barnes & Noble or something, right? But so like Social Encounters, it's published by Mad Scribe, and it's set up as a part of a source book for Sword and Caravan. Now, Social Encounters is basically a set of mechanics and that you can use with any OSR or D&D based RPG. So it's not really, even though it's technically part of that line, you can use it for, medieval fantasy, for sci-fi, for almost anything, right? With very little adaptation. But Wilderlands, my new book, I want to make that clear, is very much for Sword and Caravan. It's a set of encounter tables of monsters, a setup of protocols that you use as a DM, or that you can use as a DM if you're making a traveling / exploration campaign. A set of guidelines for the creation of families, clans, things like that, inheritances, and that sort of stuff. For native player characters, or theoretically for NPCs, that are, let's say, native of the Silk Road region, right? And rules on Eastern dragons, and lots of random tables of interesting things, right? But it's basically set up to be used either with Sword and Caravan, or in theory, if you have Sword and Caravan and you want to run, an Al-Qadim campaign, you could use it for that too, right? But it's set up as a supplement for the book, right? Not like Social Encounters, which is completely its own thing, right? That you can use it with Sword and Caravan or with Lion and Dragon. I use it with Lion and Dragon. I could use it with Dungeon Crawl Classics, right? It doesn't matter. So just keep that in mind. However, Wilderlands has been doing really, really well, apparently. I've just been told yesterday, and I have the tweet to prove it on. Well, it used to be called tweet. I don't know what it'll be called now. It'll be an exclamation, I guess. There you go. You heard it here first, folks. I saw it yesterday at an exclamation that my Wilderlands book on Amazon has hit the top 30 of Amazon's new product D&D list. So it's pretty good. It's doing quite well, apparently. So you can check it out there. You can check it out in drive-through. The link will be in the description below. Now, as to the topic of the day. So I wanted to talk a little bit about Rule Zero, because Rule Zero has been getting a lot of bad press lately in OSR circles. And I think that's kind of interesting. Now, some of this is intentionally malicious. I think Meatball agrees. Meatball is thinking deep thoughts right now about the maliciousness of certain bodies in the OSR. Is that right, Meatball? All right. So I think that there are certain people, and I'll explain who, obviously, who have an agenda of being anti-Rule Zero. And I think what a lot of people, newer people maybe in the OSR, don't realize is just how significant Rule Zero has been in the context of the OSR, right? Even right from the very beginning of the OSR, when OSR was about cloning the old school games and playing old school adventures, there was very much this emphasis that the OSR wasn't just the mechanics, but it was also about the style. And there's a lot of different things about the style of what real old school was. In real old school, and I mean that the style that the first wave OSR tried to imitate was how the old guys who had been there in the first period of the RPG hobby and the start of Dungeons and Dragons, how they experienced gaming, okay? And like the real version of how they experienced it, right? Not other stuff later that came along that is basically an invented pseudo-history. And one of the things that everybody agreed with, and I know because I was very young at the time, but I lived in the first period of the original old school, right? The ruling edition at the time I started playing was AD&D First Edition by Gary Gygax, right? And it was absolutely true that one of the elements central to the spirit of old school play was the principle of rulings, not rules. Okay, and that is in essence an extension of the Rule Zero principle, right? So for those of you who don't know, Rule Zero suggests that essentially what it says is that the DM is more important than the rules, and that's really fundamental because you have to figure out in this hobby, right? It's necessary if you want to, it becomes two very different hobbies. Or three very different hobbies, actually, depending on who you decide is in charge. Like, what is the actual hierarchy in the hobby? Because you could have a hierarchy where the person who is in charge is the DM. And that has been the traditional and natural hierarchy of RPGs almost since the very start, right? The dungeon master is the guy that's in charge of the game. He's not just a banker. He's not just a guy who shuffles cards for you. He's the guy that makes the decisions of what's happening. Okay, the players are in charge of their characters. The DM is in charge of everything else. That's how it goes. And the rules are there for the DM to use, for the players to be able to understand what they're doing, but they are subservient to the dungeon master. That's the traditional model. There have always been some people who didn't like those models, right? So there was, especially in the last 20 years, in the 2000s, you had the story gamers from the Forge movement, and those people, they were of the opinion that the hierarchy should be completely inverted. So at the very top is the game designer in the form of the rules. So if you decide that instead of the DM at your table, let's say you're playing a campaign of Lion and Dragon, right, and you decide, well, in a normal campaign, the DM would decide what to do with it, right? He would decide how to run it. He could change the rules, and he would be able to adjudicate as he pleased. Now, let's say instead you decide, no, we have to believe and trust in the pundit's genius, his God-given inspiration for Lion and Dragon, right? So that means we have to play Lion and Dragon, rules as written, right? That is ruled by the game designer. That means the game designer has primacy above everything else, and that the DM is therefore not allowed to change the rules, right? So if a player can then look up a rule and prove that the DM has judged wrong, and it means that they can hold the DM to account, then that means that the rules have primacy. And some people might say, well, that's good, right? Well, no, not really. There's a whole bunch of potential problems there. There are lots of potential problems with the DM being in charge, but because that's the traditional model, there's a lot of things that people have learned how to do around that, right? And essentially, part of the problem is too that if, let's say you've got a bad DM, well, you can always change the DM. If the policy of our hobby is no, the game designer via the rules as written is in charge, then you can never change that. If the rules as written are bad, you're stuck with that, right? It also makes no sense for reasons I will explain later on. But for starters, I can say as a game designer who's designed tons of games, let's pretend I'm not very flawed, right? I'm pretty damn excellent, all right? But let's pretend that I was flawless, right, for a second, and that I was just a perfect game designer. So I created in Lion and Dragon the perfect version of Lion. What's the matter, Meatball? The perfect version of Lion and Dragon. So it is the best medieval authentic RPG set in 1455 that you could possibly imagine with, authentic medieval monsters and magic and all of that. It's all just perfect. And the rules are really great, right? That still means you're stuck playing that, right? Like it means that you're not allowed to change that into anything to suit any other kind of campaign. So the campaign you must play with that is essentially, for it to be perfect, is essentially the Dark Albion campaign. If you wanted it to be anything else, then you're going to still have to play rules as written because that takes primacy. The DM isn't allowed to change the rules, right? So you're going to be stuck running a suboptimal system in a setting that won't work for it, right? Unless you find another game, which you also have to play rules as written, right? So essentially, you become tyrannized by a small cadre of game designers that don't even mean to be tyrannical necessarily over you, right? But I'm sure a few of them do. In the Forge, that was the whole idea. They wanted to have a setup where players are not allowed, nobody's allowed to change the rules. Like they always talked about in story gaming that actually what they want is the players to be the ones empowered. Too long have players suffered under the yoke of the evil DMs. and that they were there to liberate them so that they would be the ones in charge. And the DM would literally be able to do nothing, right? In a lot of story games, the DM is literally the monopoly banker, right? He has no power to do anything. Right? He's only there to manage the game's fund for everybody else. He's a slave, right? But they, but this is still actually an illusion because the players are not actually the ones in control there. The game designer is, because the game designer makes these games, and in the case of story games, there are these like tiny micro games, right? Like about slaves living on a plantation, or about teenage girls going for smoke breaks in the back of the fast food restaurant where they work at, right? Or about sexually frustrated Victorian university professors having a party, right? Like those are all actual games. Those are real games I just mentioned, those descriptions, right? And so like they get to control the whole ideology of what they put into those games and what they represent and everything else. And the players have freedom, but only inside those boundaries of the game that the game master that the game designer has created, right? So those are like the three options for hierarchy. And players in control is just a disaster, right? And DM in control is going to be, there are moments where you can do not too badly with rules that are written, but only if the game you want to run is precisely the game that the game designer has designed, and if you're assuming that the game designer is nearly flawless, right? And because otherwise there are going to be gaps, right? And of course, if the DM isn't allowed to change anything, because either he can change everything or he's not allowed to change anything, right? If there are any gaps, the DM can't change it, so you're stuck with something suboptimal. So this is why Rule 0 is so important. Rule 0 is basically saying that the DM is in charge. He can change the rules, okay? Now, there are dumb ways and good ways to apply Rule 0. And I think that the problem some people have with Rule 0 is that it's often applied badly by DMs. Because one of the things a DM shouldn't do is to do a ruling that is variable, right? And I mean, every DM does this at some point. I'm sure I've done it. I've run a lot of campaigns and I've had moments where I've had this issue, right? That there is something I don't quite like about how the rules are in context of the campaign. And so I do a DM call, let's say, or maybe it's somewhere where there isn't an exact rule, right? And so I make up a rule for myself and apply that to the players. And then later on, I make up a different rule about that or something very similar to that. And it's not the same rule, right? So then the players have no consistent way of knowing what they're going to face, right? Or what they're running into. And also, the Rule 0 implies that basically the DM can decide. You can roll on a random encounter table and say, no, that encounter didn't happen. I want a different encounter instead. And that's okay. But if the DM is constantly just deciding out of fiat to change things all the time, then essentially you have a world where you're at a kind of risk of it being the DM as author, which is very bad, right? And so people associate Rule 0 with this idea of DM as author or as movie director or whatever, right? Where you end up having a story game, or a storytelling game rather, where the players really just aren't allowed to do anything. And so when the DM especially applies Rule 0, like to stop players from doing something that he as DM doesn't want to see happen, that's a terrible, terrible application of Rule 0, right? Where he says, oh no, well, yeah, yes, you shot the guy, but somehow he's still alive and you don't know, and he's walking away, right? And there's not really a reason for it. You know that it's just that he changed, because then that scenario might happen if the guy has, I don't know, some kind of a spell or something, right? But if you're sure that the DM is just basically fudging it because that's the big bad guy and he doesn't want him to die in the beginning of the campaign, right? That's a huge mistake in using Rule 0. But here's what Rule 0 is really good for, is that Rule 0 can be incredibly useful to modify in many different small ways the fundamental rules of a game to fit the campaign and to fit a particular situation, because there are going to be moments where the rule won't fit, right? And now the DM needs to do this with the mentality of a clockmaker god, right? That he is there. The reason he should change a rule is not so he can get what he wants, or so he can give the players what they want, or so he can deny the players what they want, because both of those are very common Rule 0 violations, right? It's where either the DM is trying to stop a player because he's pissed off at the player because he doesn't want the player to wreck his plot or something like that. Or sometimes, he fudges to save the player, And both of those are really bad concepts, right? You don't want to do that as a DM. That should never be your motivation. What should be your motivation is a well-regulated world, right? Is this a good representation of the virtual world, right? So if something seems to be not functioning well as a representation of the world, let's say, I don't know, there's something wrong with grappling rules. Like they just, hey, you're gonna knock over all my books there, Meatball. Can you please not knock over my books? You're being too vigorous in your stroking. What are you doing with yourself? All right. So, let's say that grappling rules are just too complex or something, and they're slowing everything down. Okay, well, that's a good idea. For if you think you can do a better version of grappling rules, do that, right? Or let's say that there's like some kind of a monster and there's something about it just doesn't fit your campaign world, right? Like that the way, I don't know, wraiths are done just doesn't work for the setting that you're in, right? You want to make it different. Okay, then that's fine. Do that, right? Like you can make it different. And if you're consistent about it, you can change anything. You can change a class, right? The important thing is that it provide consistency for the players and that it work to make the world more emulative. That is to say, more realistic internally as a virtual world, not less. Right? As soon as you're changing the rules in a way that people say, well, this fucks the world, then you've got a real problem. All right? So the people that have, there are people that have a bit bad view of Rule Zero because they've had some bad experiences with bad DMs using Rule Zero badly. Okay. But then there are some other people that have been recently attacking Rule Zero because they have their own agendas, right? And chief among these being the Pro-SR, who are this anti-OSR movement that think that everybody should just have to play Advanced Dungeons and Dragons First Edition rules as written forever. But the rules as written, of a Byzantine text like the DMG is dependent on the interpretation, right? And the interpretation that they insist has to be the one of their leader, Jeffro. So I think that a lot of the people that have now in the OSR circles been attacking the idea of Rule Zero are people from the Pro-SR. Because basically they don't want any other game to be played, right? And so like they don't believe in this, right? Because they're a cult, okay? But this leads one to a very important discovery, right? That Rule Zero is essentially, and the reason it's so essential is because it is basically the foundation of the entire hobby. Okay, every single game, including, ironically, AD&D First Edition, is the product of Rule Zero thinking, okay? Because it starts when somebody looked at a set of rules and said, you know what? These don't quite work for me, okay? So famously, I've mentioned several times before, Lion and Dragon is the rule system that I use in my Dark Albion campaign. The Dark Albion campaign started as a Lamentations of the Flame Princess game, okay, by James Raggi. Very good system. Very, very innovative in its time, right? And that's not too long after its time that I started playing this. However, the system wasn't quite right for a lot of reasons to be actually medievally authentic, right? There were a number of problems that were still present in there. And as we started playing, I gradually started doing house rules, and my players kind of understood that these things were going to change, right? And so we made a series of adaptations that gradually turned into first the kind of like the bare bones Appendix P rules that appear in the Dark Albion book, and then the stuff that's in Lion and Dragon. With I've added a few things since that the original Dark Albion campaign ended that made it into Lion and Dragon before it was published. But that's basically it, right? So maybe not every game is that obviously an example of, you started with game one and then you end up creating game two, okay? But every game basically is somebody saying, well, you know what? Nobody's done a really good cowboy game or something like that, or this type of really good cowboy game. I want to do this. And these other rules don't do that. So in essence, you're still applying Rule Zero there. You're extending Rule Zero into the concept of game design. And the basic element of that is that the game designer has to precisely think with a Rule Zero mentality of how can I make this a more effective system for what I want it to be. So every game, almost every game, apart from maybe the original D&D rules, if indeed you can say there was an original, right? Because we've seen from stuff like Tonisport that people were playing this proto D&D before there was an official D&D. And almost as soon as there was an official D&D, people were playing different versions of that original D&D. This was the spirit of old school. Real old school gaming is all about this. It's all about Rule Zero. It's all about being innovative, being creative, messing around with stuff. It's not about saying, no, rules as written, play only this way. That's an exact opposite. It's like a gang of fascists trying to say, look back in our glorious past, we were all fascists, right? And it's not that, right? It is about innovation. And that's the spirit of Rule Zero. So, and can it be used badly? Yes, of course, right? But part of the essence of your game is that if you're a DM, and I'm always saying, because somebody says, oh, what happens if someone buys Lion and Dragon and runs a campaign that's, I don't know, all SJW? I'm like, well, I don't really care. If they think that's a good game, that they like, if they want to run like, I don't know, the Crusades as a feminist retelling, and that's when they can find people that are happy to run that at their table. That's great, because you know what? It's not my game anymore. Once you buy it, it's your game to do with as you wish, right? That was our dream with 5th edition for me and Mike Merles, that we were hoping, because we made it into one of the most easily modifiable games, or definitely the most easily modifiable edition of official D&D ever, with the idea that everybody was going to do all their own house rules and stuff like that. And of course, then none of them did, because the great tragedy that Jeffro has is that he's a Gen Xer, I assume. He might be a millennial. I don't know. But that he's probably an early millennial. So he's one of these millennials that was born too early to actually connect to the people that just desperately want to be told what to do, right? And so he's trying to appeal to the OSR crowd, when what he really should be appealing to is all of these, 25-year-old aging spinsters that play that are the number one fans of 5th edition, and who think that it should be all rules as written. Of course, the problem is he didn't write it, and there are actually people there who can lay claim to it. So it's not surprising that a movement like the Bro-SR only appeared after Gygax died, right? Because if Gygax was here, and I mean, we still have quotes of him that make it super clear that everything that these guys say is wrong, and that Gygax would have denounced them. So there we have it. I guess that's everything for today. If you like this video, please hit the like button. Please share it everywhere that you think people will find it interesting, or where people might be pissed off at it. And be sure to subscribe if you haven't subscribed, and hit the notification bell. I am doing more community. I mean, I'm doing community posting on my YouTube channel now, which I used to do on Twitter, but ever since the incident, now that even though I'm back on X, I'm still decided that YouTube is the place I want to focus on, because I want to focus on you guys. Okay, so hit the notification button. Make sure you don't miss the community posts, including very frequent occasions of showing pictures of Meatball. Okay, so that if you want more Meatball, be sure to hit the notification bell. All right. And if you want to support me, be sure to check out my products, like my brand new Wilderlands source book. If you haven't got it already, Sword and Caravan and Social Encounters, Lion and Dragon, the Gonzo Fantasy Companion. Check out all my RPG Pundit Presents series, which the links are all in the description below. So you can get products of mine anywhere from as little as, I don't know, $1.99 all the way to, I think, $60 for the deluxe version of the Invisible College, something like that, right? So no matter what, there's something that fits your wallet size, and there's such a range. There are like 120 products, right? You're gonna find something that you will find useful to play with, but you're also, giving me some cash and helping me keep fighting the good fight and maintaining the cause. All right. So I really appreciate that. Be sure to check out my stuff. There's more new stuff coming soon. But check out everything I've already done, because you're likely missing something that's interesting in all of that. I guess that's everything for today. Currently smoking, or currently about to smoke, Stanwell Pipe of the Year 2019 plus Argento Roots.